Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, both near and far, because this evening is live streamed, and we're so delighted that this lecture will be heard by the world. For those I have not yet had the pleasure to meet, I am Amy Myers, Director of the Yale Center for British Art, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for this evening, Suzanne Preston Blier. Suzanne is the Alan Whitehill Clowes Professor of Fine Arts and Professor of African and American Studies at Harvard University. She is also chair of the International Advisory Committee for World Map, an electronic interactive mapping database that she helped to found at Harvard University that has had a great reach, I think, and is profoundly important as precedent setting. From 2017 to 18, she served as president of the College Art Association, and currently she is a member of the board of the National Committee for the History of Art. Two of her articles appeared in the Art Bulletin's Centennial Anthology, which included 33 essays judged as the finest in the field from the last century. And her most recent publications include Picasso's Demoiselles, The Untold Story of the Origins of a Modern Masterpiece, published this year, and forthcoming, 1325, A History of Modernity's Origins in Africa and the Western Islamic World. Suzanne's other distinguished books include Art and Risk in Ancient Yoruba, which was awarded the Prose Prize in Art History and Criticism, African Vodun, Art, Psychology, and Power, which won the Charles Rufus Maury Prize, The Anatomy of Architecture, Ontology and Metaphor in Batam Maliba Architectural Expression, which was awarded the Arnold Rubin Prize, and The Image of the Black in African and Asian Art, edited with David Beinman and Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Tonight's lecture is entitled Of Punch Bowls, Gold Regalia, Divine Kinship and Slaves, Asante, England and America, 1390 to 1980. Suzanne notes that among the more noteworthy objects brought back by British troops after their 1896 sack of Kumasi, the capital of Asante in modern Ghana, are two English works, a Richard II bronze ewer dated to the 1390s, and a silver punch bowl bearing a 1764 London hallmark. Both objects came to figure prominently in Asante court ritual and regalia and provide insights into larger global events in these and other eras. Indeed, this lecture will explore the nearly 6 centuries of exchange, influence, and cross-currency between these important centers, since West African Gold Coast traditions also have had an impact on English court and culture throughout this long period, and of course, by extension, have affected in very deep, profound, and important ways the culture of the world. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Suzanne to the podium. Suzanne.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and indeed an honor. And right off the start, let's imbibe. Let's begin with punch. And think broadly about the implications not only of alcohol, but also of those important vessels in which it long was served. And one of the interesting things about this broader research project are the ways in which different kinds of objects intersect with each other over a broad period of time, and not only inform key events, but in fact are critical parts of the energizing elements of those events and various relationships. So the vessel at the top left is a sterling silver covered punch bowl with a London mark of 1764, a date that everyone here knows to have been incredibly important in the United States and in Great Britain. It was the year of the Sugar Act. It was also, and not coincidentally, the year of the Fanti blockade of the Gold Coast ports, leaving separated from the critical gold reserves the British, the Dutch, and others. So from the vantage point of this important blockade of the Gold Coast ports, there followed real concern in Britain and in Holland and elsewhere of the impacts of this blockade on their own well-being. And in part, as a result of that, they began to shower the Asante court with punch bowls and coffee pots and a whole series of other very expensive silver hollowware. We also know, and I would say sort of in part in jest, but it's hard for me to imagine that the American Revolution would have actually unfolded and have been the success it was without punch. Indeed, the most celebrated and in some ways most valuable object at the MFA for Fine Arts is the Paul Revere Punch Bowl. Men with punch in public spaces do things that otherwise they might not. And punch as a liquor that in its own way conforms to key aspects of three continents: India with the spices and also with citrus, Africa with enslaved individuals who are brought to the Americas to work and harvest sugar, and here as well the return of liquor into the larger global community, and the impacts of punch not only in the Americas but also in Africa in its own form and in Europe. This talk is in part about that history of punch and before then of other vessels that make their way into what is today Ghana. It's also about the post-histories, the legacies of these events, and the ways that these have stirred artists and individuals to rethink the past. So I have before us here a wonderful Yinka Shonibari sculpture, part of his Lord Nelson series of 2013, where he takes up the theme of sailing vessels and encounters across continents with his characteristic inclusion of African factory-made cloth as a key part of the sails of the ships themselves. In this case, reinforcing the idea that where we think about merchants and sailors, we cannot lose sight of the fact that Africa and its individuals were a critical component of that. But this talk, I think most importantly, or at least my interest in it, began as a mystery, and indeed one that has intrigued a number of scholars. The African historian Jack Goody, who was a specialist in the cultures of Ghana, noted at the front of one of his many volumes that if we could solve the mystery of how the Richard II ewer got to the Gold Coast, we would know an awful lot more about the whole tradition and trade routes between Europe and Africa in this critical period, and perhaps later. And it was this, in part, this mystery that led me on a journey of really a discovery to try to reimagine how this took place and what it would tell us about both the vessel itself and its position within Asante society. In the end, however, it also took me back to Britain in really important ways. This vessel today, it's a bronze vessel, it's heavy and stands about this tall, is considered one of the finest ewers or pitchers from this period of Richard II that is still extant. And it is one of the objects of considerable primacy in the British Museum itself. The reason why it has survived is simply a fluke of history. When the British came to Kumasi and really destroyed that city, in part to lay claim to the primacy and resource of gold, they attempted to bomb the Royal Mortuary Center where this vessel and other objects were housed, and the bomb did not go off. So when they returned, they found it and some other important objects. You can see it on the right under a tree in the center of one of the Asante courtyards, and beneath it one of a series of really quite striking photographs of the late 19th century that are in the Basel Museum Mission. So this story is in fact about three objects and then some. It's about the Richard II ewer. It's about the covered sterling punch bowl from 1764. And it's about an array of Asante gold regalia, including this wonderful gold sun disc. I've divided the talk into basically 4 parts. 2 of them I realized after I had accepted to come here to give this talk, I'd given in part earlier at Yale, and in key respects, this talk is both a sort of 2/3 more and different material than the original one. Also, it offered me a unique opportunity to rethink some of these questions around the ideas of a possible exhibit, and also about some of the changing issues that we've been addressing from the vantage point of repatriation and context of reimagining the history of these relationships. So this first part, gold as action, is one of the things that I've introduced recently to this larger subject. And we see on the map Kumasi, the capital of the Asante culture in the Gold Coast, and a photograph on the right of one of the many kings who, in this incredibly rich gold regalia, has been seated for a portrait. The Gold Coast, of course, was named after the primacy of gold found in this area, gold that was, in the medieval period, circulated broadly northward across the Sahara and into Europe, particularly after 1300, when the gold standard was established, making its way to many places via the Islamic world in Andalusia, northward into Catalan, into France, Great Britain, and elsewhere. Gold made the world run, and in some respects, of course, it still does. But what did gold mean in Ghana itself? And how can we begin to understand that feature of these connections within the terms of the Asante themselves? Sometimes in answering those questions, it's important to look at popular culture, or indeed fiction, or in this case, a movie that I saw, which I found particularly striking in what it reveals to us about the complexities and paradoxes within the subject of gold itself. This is a 2009 Ghanaian film, Sikamu Sakawa, literally medicinal gold, and it's a story of striking interest and drama of a couple, the woman of whom was unable to get pregnant, and her husband and she were distraught, and he went around finding a possible answer to this dilemma, paid for someone to help out in the cause in a kind of medicinal, magical way. She goes through a normal pregnancy and begins to have a normal delivery when everything goes awry. The baby is born, but she soon discovers that the baby is not a human, miniature or otherwise, but a large pile of money. And what this means and what it references is the importance not only of blood, as in lineage relationships and heritage, but also sacrifice, and the means in which magic and gold, currency and money are all conveyed and evoked within the same larger system of kind of checks and balances, but more so a system that is questioning wherever money is coming from. And in a certain sense, this is also a parable, I think, in our country today. So where does money come from, particularly blood money, as it is referred to here? The Asante have a really quite striking tradition around this. Historically, gold ornaments, gold powder, could not simply be spent in the market or otherwise. It is something that one inherited, and one had to preserve, often these objects in special containers kept within the mortuary or memorial confines of the family shrine, only to be brought out for 2 really important purposes. One was for ceremonial attire, and the other was paying for the larger festivities or ceremonies that served to honor the dead and to reunite the community at large. That is considered not only the most authentic, but the most valued way of presenting oneself and using gold. Gold is also, however, identified with the acquirement of new kinds of possessions that speaks to one's status and identity, such as these massive mansions that are now being built in the southern part of Ghana. This idea of inherited gold or money and acquired gold or money represent the two poles that intersect between these worlds and realize the complexity of these two traditions. And both in their way are also legitimated and reaffirmed and reified within two of the most important Asante arts. One is the famous golden stool, the Sika Dwa, which is said to have floated down from the heavens as a legitimate seat of power in 1701 by Osi Tudu, the founder of the Asante state. And you can see this golden stool here resting on its own chair with bells and other regalia beside it. This references inherited gold par excellence. And on the other hand, and equally important, is the gold elephant tail, which is seen to represent the sort of ideal of somebody who's been able to capture gold, to control gold, to bring gold into the family and into the community through his or her own means. By this, we mean through war or through trade or through other kinds of avenues that allow one to enrich the family heritage, to preserve that and safeguard it for a future generation. And within both of these acts, there's the complex issue of power, of magic, and of medicine. And how is it that in war one is successful or not? Or in trade one is successful or simply is losing money for oneself and one's family? And that is where larger questions of sorcery and medicine, protection, and advance all come into play. And here, too, gold plays a critical role. Indeed, the gold weights, which themselves are cast of brass historically, are often associated with imagery on the weights themselves that speak to this important balance between values, goals, ideals, and things to be careful about. Historically, it was abra seeds, which we see here with their red surround and black eye, that reference sorcery, which was used in the weights themselves, a kind of call to mind of the dangers of gold and of currency and the balance of all of these concerns. Asante scholarship is enriched in many ways by the array of important books that have been written. Bowditch was one such book, and we can see somebody handling one of these gold weight balances. Every family had its own. There were different weight standards, although they were somewhat comparable, one family to the others. The king had the heaviest weights, which meant that he got more when he was interacting with others. But all of this is part of the larger system. And here we can see some of the weights that rely more closely on Islamic traditions, at the top, the geometric forms, and more characteristically with European, British, and other traditions in their figural references after, initially the Portuguese round the bend in the mid-15th century, and the Dutch and British and others arrive in the centuries that follow. What's also important to keep in mind is not only the regalia of gold weighing and gold trade, but also a reality that is quite shocking and indeed quite striking, particularly for art historians. One of the things that had to happen in the annual Odwira festival, or Yam festival, was that all of this gold regalia that people had been purportedly accumulating for generations, the main part of it are said to have been melted down and cast into new forms. What that means is that gold was itself the subject of ongoing creativity of the sort that a museum really would be quite horrified to imagine for its own collections. But in many ways, this also nurtured creativity and at the same time provided a certain amount of profit for the king, since he got to tax a certain percentage of the gold after it had been melted down and recast. So at the bottom, we see the Odwira Yam Festival. It's hard to imagine the amount of gold that is displayed, but you get a sense of some of it in the lower right. And the close relationship between these architectural contexts and the decorative contexts that were featured concomitantly with them. What's also important to recall about Asante gold are the ways in which it is related to traditions of vessels that have come in from other areas. We know that there are several, as a matter of fact, a number of brass vessels from the Western Islamic world that have arrived in Africa in the 14th century. There's an important one that was recently discovered in Nigeria. And in the lower left, we see one of several of these vessels, Mamluk vessels, that are found in shrines along the rivers where the gods that are associated with the panning of gold are identified. What is striking to me in this tradition, at least in Ghana, is these very expensive vessels that have come miles and miles away as part of trade in luxury goods are not found in the houses of elites, but rather they're positioned on the important shrines of gods that are seen to provide the very well-being on which society itself is founded. And if one could imagine one particularly important art form with the Asante culture, it is vessels of this sort that in one way or another reflect on some of these histories of trade. The gold manufacturing itself, or the gold mining itself, was done in family units in particular. And one of the things about this goes back to the same kind of ideas of magic and medicine and power. As in gold mining more generally, it's not everyone that lands on gold that is productive. And here, too, there are metaphors that are used in reference to it. One of the ideas is that when you see certain aya ferns, they indicate that there's likelihood of having gold beneath the surface. And so that becomes an important motif in regalia forms such as the sun discs. And then these, in turn, get incorporated into palace facade bas-reliefs and other forms as references to ideas such as survival and triumph over adversity, endurance, and other ideas. These same motifs are found in the gold weights, in mortuary cloths, and on facades as a reference to, again, this kind of not only struggle, but this balance between humility and power and strength, references to the past as a resource for the future, the idea of knowledge as a vital source of power, and the fact that wisdom itself can really transform every situation. I think what's also important, and I will come back to it shortly, is the importance of these particular discs and what it says about power in the Asante area more generally, particularly in conjunction with royalty. Among the Asante and in life more generally, sometimes one has to do things that are considered to be amoral or against the grain of larger societal interests, whether it is in war, in sacrifice, and other means. And in the Asante, there's a special individual, a soul watcher, who will wear one of these circular gold discs on the solar plexus, historically an enslaved individual, and basically bear the weight of the various misdeeds and wrongful acts that the king and society itself had borne. And here, too, these same metaphors evoked in the power of these particular signs is readily apparent. From here, we're going to go back in time and to Richard II himself and think about history in the making. He was, of course, an incredibly interesting and important king, as short-lived as his reign actually was. And the art forms associated with his rule are some of the most striking from this late medieval period. There is no doubt that he knew of the famous West African king Mansa Musa, who spent so much gold on the Hajj that he caused a crash in the economic system when he was in Cairo and then Mecca, as reinforced in the famous Catalan map of 1375, which shows trade routes between Europe and Africa in this period. And here we see Mansa Musa engaging with one of the Berber or other rulers on the back of a camel, suggesting this kind of movement of ideas and objects of value in this important period. The artworks associated with Richard II's reign, as I noted, are quite striking. Some of them allow us to identify key iconography on the Richard II ewer, among other things, his famous unicorn. There are a series of other elements as well. What's also, I think, quite striking is that many of these evoke the power and importance of gold in Richard's reign, a reign that itself apparently was characterized by a rather striking dearth of gold in this period. So we have to be careful about what is represented and what it represents from the vantage point of related lacks. It was a striking period in British history. He himself was in part concerned about questions of death. This is in the aftermath of the Black Death of 1347 to 8 and continuation of those particular concerns in the decades after. His first wife had died and he himself had established a number of baths. He's identified with a series of gold coins that are of striking interest, and it is around this time that some have argued that the idea of divine kingship in England and in France begins to take root. And from that, we can begin to think about both the singularity and the strangeness of ideas such as royal unction. After all, a king is born like anyone else. And yes, there is in England traditions of inheritance that define who one is in relationship to one's predecessor, but the idea of a special kind of oil or grease that marks one as royal in a kind of very specific way, I think is particularly interesting around this time. There have been a number of scholars who have looked at the Richard II ewer. There are several like it, but none of this scale or importance. But very few have really tried to address its overall function. I've been through the long lists of objects that were part of his reign that have been detailed after he had died. Many of these are gold ewers and silver ewers and any number of other objects of precious metals and jewels. A bronze ewer, though, is quite strange. And not only its scale, but also its weight makes it a highly unusual kind of vessel to have used as a kind of table service. My guess is that based on the form itself and a couple of other tripod-footed vessels that were found in conjunction with it, probably by the same artist group, perhaps from Norwich, which was an area where large bells were being cast. I think it was used for the royal bath, to carry the heated water into the area where the king was bathing. We have no real evidence for this other than it's hard to imagine another kind of use, except that unusual feature at the bottom of the handle, a kind of posy or flower, consistent with the use of flowers in bathing and other contexts. As we know, in the medieval period, baths were not only important, but in some cases, as in the painting in the lower left, quite strange in their highly social and other kinds of engagements at this time. The bath took on a very different meaning than perhaps we can imagine it today. There's been quite a bit of scholarship on the text that surrounds the vessel itself. Adam Kumler has recently written an interesting article that is forthcoming where she looks at the verse. I've tried to track it down to a particular source with various scholars, and that has so far eluded me. It simply might be one of those phrases that got repeated and defined at a certain moment in time. But it speaks to the idea of humbleness, of humility. I'll read it here, or you can. He that will not spare when he may, he shall not spend when he would deem the best in every, don't till the throw the be tried oat. It's a sort of interesting text that speaks to ideas of sparing, of moral justice, and of not basically putting on one's airs. Aidan speaks about it as kind of musical verse, that as one is moving this vessel, it may take on a kind of rhythm of its own. But as I'm looking at it and thinking about the royal bath and the idea of royal unction and taking off one's clothes, even as intermediately as it is done, and thinking about that as a moment in the life of a king in particular, in which that idea of being spare and thinking about this particular quality takes on unique importance. There are other arts associated with Richard II, from brooches to crowns to manuscripts, references to the famous peasants' revolt toward the beginning of his reign, in part from the lack of labor, the aftermath of the great devastation of the Black Death, to rethinking his own death, and indeed through Shakespeare, reimagining the complexities of this period, engaging around in part the idea of divine kingship. And whether or not one wants to take the line of Kantorowicz or others, it is a really important moment to engage. There are other things about his reign and those of his peers in France and elsewhere that I find particularly striking, most notably the livery collars of gold and other materials with their circular medallions. Livery collars which he gave to relatives, to those in the court and other servants among these who were incredibly powerful, and also who owed him an allegiance beyond others, a kind of evocation of a kind of relationship as kind of slave to master, and I'm intentionally saying that as something that really goes deep into the ties that bind particular people together around ideas of loyalty. And of course, these same livery collars get taken up and reused in different forms in other important portraiture and other kinds of situations in England, in Canada, and other parts of the world that are connected in one way or another with the early British Empire. And that takes us to form, which is always interesting and complex and complicating in their various ways. Where do these forms come from? Whether we're talking about the gold sun discs, the earliest examples of which we have are from the 18th century, although some of very similar ones we find in places like Senegal in the 13th century. In fact, these kinds of pendant forms that are often worn over the solar plexus, that part of the body that actually can receive a fatal blow, have a wide history and go back to early Mesopotamia and through various periods in between. What I can say about this form in brief is that if you see somebody walking down the street with a gold medallion over the chest, you simply have to stand back and look carefully. It must be of someone of import. It comes from various sources, and whether it's a rosette, as in a flower, or a solar motif, as in the Asante example, it has a long legacy and a long history. And what do we make of the livery collar itself? In its form, of course, it's a series of chains, but can we link it to the importance not only of slave collars, but also of the importance of related collars in the early Mali state, where dogs were among those who were given such collars, and how do these relate in one way or another with the importance of slavery? We also have to recall that in the medieval period and later, there were nearly as many enslaved individuals who were transported across the Sahara into Spain, into Sicily, then Italy, and into the Middle East as ended up in the Americas. And often these enslaved individuals were part of families. It was unlike in the Americas, generally for one generation only. And if they were not part of the family, they were often put into local craft guilds or into the army, so in service and working alongside others. So the impacts and the importance of this trade, one could say, but also of this investment of individuals and ideas, not only as part of a system of economic disempowerment and re-empowerment, but also of culture and idea exchange. It is important, and I think we often overlook it. The third part takes us actually to punch, to slavery, and to the revolution. And to anyone who has ever made punch, you know how, at least at the point in time when it was particularly important in this country, it often was used for things such as festivities at New Year's or when a child was being named. And its history is almost as important as the kind of celebration it is associated with. And that takes us to this really quite interesting punch bowl, and to the history of punch that is associated with it. This is a vessel I find interesting, not so much because of its craftsmanship and its date, although those are clearly important, but rather because of the attention to detail in its reparation. That cover, it's almost as if it is itself a woven object of tin, or rather of silver. It has been repaired and carefully put back together after years, after perhaps centuries of use. And what was that use? In the Asante area, in Kumasi in particular, liquor was imbibed before individuals on behalf of the king went to war. It was a kind of feast and celebration both before and after conquest. So one could readily imagine how much use this vessel got, and knowing that it was hammered sterling silver, and silver itself is relatively light, the fact that it has been preserved to this date is particularly striking. Another feature that strikes me of particular interest about this is that in the British Museum website, it is identified, despite its 1764 London stamp, as an Asante charm. It is an African work. And I find that interesting in part because so much of its use took place in Africa, in Ghana in particular. And this takes us directly to the ewer and the question of when and how it arrived here. There's several different possibilities for its venture from Britain to Ghana. One obvious one would have been in the trans-Saharan trade, sometime after 1390, and perhaps after Richard's death, so it would have been after 1400, making its way here as a treasured object. However, in 1400, the Asante state did not exist. It only came into power several centuries later. That doesn't mean it couldn't have been on some other shrine, but it wouldn't have had the use that it has today. Another possibility is that it came by way of the Portuguese, and Richard certainly had relatives, his own uncle, with close ties with both Spain and Portugal. So when Henry the Navigator's fleets came around the coast of Africa and ultimately to reach Ghana so that Europeans could control the gold trade rather than the Muslims by way of Andalusia and Granada in particular, it's possible that it had made its way to Portugal by that time and reached the West Coast at that moment. But I think there's an easier and better answer, and that is in the form of not so much the punch bowl, but in local objects which are crafted after it as a kind of reference through this incredible period of exchange between the Gold Coast and Europe. And if we look at these gold sword ornaments on the royal swords with their characteristic handles, you'll see here on the left is a cannon. In the middle is a trophy head, and on the right is a covered punch bowl, in some ways quite similar to the one that has come from London. But you'll also notice here, and really very striking, is that at the base of its handles are flower-like forms that decorate it. And this suggests to me that quite likely the Richard II ewer arrived with or soon after or soon before the silver punch bowl, and that together these are reflected in these miniaturized versions of this vessel and other forms that have been dated to roughly the 1760s, which was a time of some turmoil within the Asante area and the turnover of the throne around this time. This was not the only object that the Asante decided to celebrate and memorialize through a miniature form. I find the work on the left from the same 1760s period, a couple inches tall only, is a work of just striking interest and power in what it reflects about these relationships. I haven't found the exact reference to it, but if you look at both English and French loving cups from this period, that kind of Baroque treatment of the surface is especially striking. And then we get tea vessels and other sorts. Punch bowls have their own history, and no matter what collection one is looking at, there are always, at least in most collections, an interesting group of these kinds of vessels. They're associated with revolution and liberty and victory. They're also closely associated with the slave ship era, and there are a whole series of these that were commissioned often from China to celebrate the launching of slave ships such as the Nancy in 1766. Harvard University has its own punch bowl and its own traditions of being punched to get into finals clubs, which is not a physical combat, but basically how well one can retain one's liquor and carry on a conversation, I guess. Yale, I'm sure, has its own special punch bowls. This is actually the one for Harvard that was given to it to designate it as an important sort of sign of its being an official university. And I brought in one from Yale, which is early and important, and by a New Haven silversmiths. But there are other punch bowls as well. This one at the Brooklyn Museum I particularly like because it was made by an African American and speaks to freedom, the longing for freedom, in a wooden vessel of the same sort. And the one on the right I find at once odd and really interesting. It was created in the aftermath of the British conquest of the Gold Coast. And in the very center of it is a gold sun disk as kind of a harken back to the very legacy of Asante gold, power, and reversal and triumph more generally. When we talk about punch, we also have to talk about piracy, because that, of course, is part of the broader legacy. And thanks to piracy, we have a wealth of gold regalia, particularly small items of jewelry that was lost off the coast of Cape Cod and are preserved in Wellfleet to this day. And what is particularly striking about this gold bullion is examples of it were also brought back to places like London, melted down and reshaped into forms that became important to London and to jewelry. Thinking here too about war and art and reparations and repairs, thinking through how in some cultures, Japan, for example, joining is important, or even in the Asante royal drinking vessel, which is a gourd, you can see these elements in play. What I find interesting, too, are the ways in which we know about particular ships that brought individuals from the Gold Coast, such as this from an advertisement in Philadelphia, for a Negro man, a goldsmith by trade, who know how to blow horns, and there was a sale sought for him. And we know in Philadelphia was founded some of the first important silver shops that engaged African Americans, both from Philadelphia and places like Jamaica and other places in the Caribbean. So when we think about punch ladles and we think about enslaved individuals, we also think about the transition of people and ideas in this very practice. And finally, I think it's important to think of the aftermath of this from the vantage point of what happened as part of the movement to end slavery in Britain. And this was a movement almost at the opposite extreme of public punch bowl drinking largely by men. And this was the movement by women in the privacy of their homes and in the service of tea to identify sugar, particularly sugar from the West Indies, as a vile product made through the boiling of enslaved individuals, and therefore to avoid it at all cost and only use sugar from the East Indies. So here we have examples of that same kind of process, but in reverse. In the final section, and just briefly on the legacies, whether we're thinking about ideas of divine kingship and what are the sources for this. In Africa, divine kingship, particularly among the Asante and in some ways in other cultures, whether Yoruba or Mali, are well defined and evoke important ideas of power related to not only one's legacy within one's lineage, but also divine ideas of power and legitimacy more generally. Were any of these ideas circulating north? In the aftermath of this, we also can think about the importance of African trade companies, the origins of the African trade company itself, and sculptures such as this really wonderful Jan Claudius de Kock figure of 1704, which is envisioned as a Gold Coast figure, complete with medallion, references in the coiffure to the Cape Coast castle, a charter, a trade charter itself, another form which references the balances, the gold balances, and even kente cloth, perhaps, in the draping around the groin. And all of these goldsmiths in London who are melting down gold from the Gold Coast, whether in powder form or in the form of local artworks, jewelry in particular, was there any transition of the kind of light filigree work that became important in the transition from heavy gold jewelry that was then being cast in places like London and France to these lighter forms that came into vogue? And punch bowls as trophies, whether in their own right or in thinking about other related forms of victory that come out of the legacy of sailing ships, the slave trade, and ideas of commerce in individuals and items of power. But perhaps the most striking example of the cross-currencies of these relationships occurred actually in 1988, when an exhibition from the British Museum, the Arts of Ghana, came to New York City to be exhibited at the American Museum of Natural History. And on that occasion, the Asantehene, or king of the Asante, marched with his court up Columbus Avenue, elaborately clothed in gold and patterned kente cloth, as well as an array of gold jewelry. Lining each side of the street were individuals from this neighborhood and from elsewhere. And in the same year, Run DMC and others begin to wear gold bling, necklaces and other forms that seem in part to be closely referenced on this occasion. The power of gold is a reference to Africa, to legitimacy, and to power more generally. And we all know traditions of kente having a similar kind of status identity and identity with history and power in other kinds of contexts. So in the end, I think what we can think about also are questions of legacy, repatriation, and in part because I think it's important to discussions today about objects and ownership. The covered punch bowl today is identified in the British Museum as an Asante object, an object of power and of magic. The Richard II ewer, although it had an important life, a long life probably in the Gold Coast today, is a critical marker of English history and of the primacy of Richard II. And what about the origins of the gold sun discs? Or what do we do with the punch bowl with its sun disc at its very center? or even traditions such as those that were established in 1988 by Run DMC. In short, there are lots of questions, few answers, and I think it's interesting in part to think about a model that the British Museum itself has done in the ideas of collaborations around objects from Benin. So just to recap, gold is part of action in the Asante area, reinforcing ideas of value and judgment. Richard II, ideas of history in the making, whether it's through bathing or idioms of divine kingship. Punch, slavery, revolution, and piracy, and an array of objects that really circulate between these continents, both in the objects themselves, their manufacture, and in the punch that is served inside them, and then the legacies of these various traditions and how they help to shape our understanding of these worlds today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for what we anticipated as an incredible cross-cultural examination that would take us well beyond these two objects into the fabric of our own world and the way it is dependent on centuries of transglobal exchange between and amongst those in Britain and Africa, ultimately the Americas, as you've turned those relationships so beautifully on these objects and where we find ourselves today. I smile so much because so many of the objects that are of the making of artists in Britain today, and in fact in the past have been in these galleries over the last few years. And you really, I think, both distilled their power and importance in new ways for us, and also synthesize the histories out of which they come. But I'm sure that our very, I think, eager audience, a very refined audience here, would be very eager to ask some questions of your talk. So I pass the microphone to the audience.
Very nicely done. I'm an American historian interested in the gold rush. Could you tell us a little bit about the mining process in Africa? Were the nuggets lying around? Did they have enslaved people? Did it enrich certain families? How long did the, quote, gold rush in Africa go on?
Well, I'll speak only to the traditions in Ghana. There are other in East Africa. There were also important gold mines in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. Most of the gold in Ghana was in the natural environment, along riverbeds and in areas adjacent. And there were some that sort of seeped out of these areas, particularly after rainstorms. So in fact, one could occasionally be very lucky and find a nugget of some size or another. More generally, one dug for them rather deep sort of tunnels into the ground, and then used water to basically as a sieve. A lot of the digging was done by men, and the sieving was done by women, and then it was carefully weighed, and things that were not part of the gold were removed. Most of it was done by families, so small family units who in other parts of the year, other times of the year, were doing agriculture and other work, so it was combined with other economic activities. The Gold Coast, Ghana, was one of the few areas in Africa that for the most part did not send enslaved individuals to the Americas and elsewhere. For the most part, they either brought people in to help in this process or simply were wealthy enough through the gold so that they were exporting it instead. There were some enslaved individuals. The court, the king, had individuals who were working for them. Again, much as I was explaining for Europe, for the most part, slavery here meant not based on race and intergenerational but was simply for that period of one's own life, and even then there were often contexts in which one could move outside of it. But the gold mining today is done industrially, and it is one of the important exports of Ghana.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question about the sort of metallic differences, right, between these objects and the status that bronze or silver would have had in Asante or in Ghana, since the objects which, right, made their way from England, did they have a kind of monetary or exchange value as metals versus as objects at that moment? And B, sort of how that question of them not being gold objects, but rather being markers of other kinds of workmanship or sort of inherited or legacy, how you imagine that impacting
Right.
how they were used.
That's a really great question. We know from the medieval period that in the era of Mansa Musa, this wealthy emperor, that I think it's Ibn Battuta, the traveler who arrives in Mali slightly later, identifies in this period that more money is made by sending copper to the south than by gold going to the north. Copper meaning one of the critical materials of bronze. Copper is red. Copper is also mined in Nigeria and other places, but that kind of redness and its importance is really striking. In this period in the 1760s, one of the most remarkable things that I found is that in this period, ships in Wales and Ireland and other ports in Britain are being stripped of their metal surfaces, and that copper alloy is being shipped to West Africa, to the Gold Coast and elsewhere, by the tons. And that's being sent north and cast into bracelets and other forms. So bronze has huge value. Silver is more interesting. There are silver mines in southern Morocco, and silver was probably going south. It's certainly one of the primary materials for the Tuareg, the Berbers, and others. Slightly, and they are to the north of this. At the point in which silver coins are being used in France and elsewhere in the I'm just trying to think of my dates. In the late 18th century, they're also being imported into the kingdom adjacent to the Asante, into Dahomey, where they're items of enormous status. And that may be in part because it's a different color than either gold or bronze, and therefore takes on a certain royal identity. And one of the things that's particularly interesting from this vantage point, of course, none of these metals are used except for hammered gold, in their own right. You've got other elements which are added to them to give them greater density, et cetera. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art found that the Dahomey silver had the least amount of silver in it of any that they had ever studied, vis-a-vis other elements, basically just enough to make it look silver so that one could spread the glitter as far as possible. But I think that's a really key question.
Other questions?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a short question asking about whether we could think of the transit of those objects from different areas to the Gold Coast through the lens of collecting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's a really important question too, as you know. Let me go forward in time a bit to the 19th century, where the Asantehene, the king of the Asante, actually builds a stone house, a kind of museum of sorts where he places silver holloway and other objects as a kind of collection of exotic foreign goods, in the same way that the French king in Versailles is collecting various things from other places, and curio cabinets get developed in many places. So I think that's really interesting. What I don't, there are pieces of it I don't quite, I can't quite grapple with from this vantage point. Some of these are actually important power objects, such as the Mamluk vessel, which is overturned on the shrine for the river gods to bring more gold. So that probably is not collecting in so much as it is payback to the gods for providing more, in a sense. And I think the punch bowl itself is also part of an object that really was heavily used. But maybe we can think of those miniature sword ornaments, sort of following your point, as in some way references, like today we would use photographs or prints of paintings as kind of memories of these objects that were brought in, whether they were used in one way or another. And it's certainly true that there were large wooden cabinets where many of these objects were kept. Moving a little bit to the west, to give another example, the Viceroy of Ouida, Francisco de Souza, who was deeply embedded in the slave trade and was one of the wealthiest individuals in the world, apparently, in the 18th century, is said to have had an art collection, paintings and other things, without peer. So there was no doubt that art collecting was important. And I think that's a really interesting point.
Rob. Oh, did you want to follow up? No, I'm just pointing to Rob. To someone down here. There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very nice lecture. I've been studying recently ornaments on artifacts of war, like shields or swords. And what I've learned is that these ornaments are not ornament. They are signs or some signifying agents that aid in the battle. So shields have intimidating figures on them or something like that. Which brings me to the swords. Can you understand those ornaments as somehow expressions of power in the Asante society, perhaps, that a person that would have, say, the larger object, this is just a condensation of the larger object, a person that would have the larger object is a very powerful person or something like that? Or is this line of thought not useful?
No, it's very useful, and I would say at the outset that ideas that implements of war would contain references to power is deeply embedded in many African traditions as well, apotropaic or otherwise, also protective in some ways. Both work in concert with each other. Those particular sword ornaments are from a particular region outside of Kumasi, and we know the name of that family that owned them. Those particular swords are swords which are used for swearing oaths. So they would have not been taken to battle per se, but would have been used to reinforce ideas of loyalty and actions to be made. My guess, and I hadn't really thought of it in these terms until you brought it up, is that many of the elements referenced in them in some ways reference the benefits that come from military victory and agency vis-a-vis Europe and the outside. So, for example, they're lions. And while lions are an African animal, in Africa, in West Africa, they come into use primarily through England in particular. The royal lion then gets back disseminated back in the 19th century and earlier. So it's a reference to power in other places. The barrel of gunpowder would be another example, as would these punch bowls, tea kettles, etc. I think the only difference, and I think it's a really important exception, is that there are a number of these that reference trophy heads. And it's a really interesting phenomenon in Africa that we don't necessarily think about it in Europe at all in the same way, which is in Africa, one is really careful if one has killed somebody of import, of power, because of the potential danger that that person, through his soul, could bring back to oneself and one's family. So things happen here on earth and things happen out there, and you're kind of protecting against all of it. So the thinking is that the heads of enemies who are depicted in the art, whether here or Benin and in other places, is a kind of honorific of sorts. It's certainly stating that, you know, I defeated you and I have your head, but it's also saying that you were so powerful that I want to honor you in this way. And I don't know what to make of that in relationship to what's happening with Europe, except to say that these references and these kind of relationships were incredibly complex. And sometimes, I don't know this specifically for Asante, but in Dahomey, which is the neighboring kingdom, they were commissioning saint sculptures from France and bringing them back and identifying with attributes so that they would have easier access to the Western gods so that they could use these deities for their own benefits. So there is this kind of thinking, and I'm sure particularly with the idea of alcohol and punch and power, and these were, I mean, there are some British punch bowls that are like 2 meters wide. I mean, these are ginormous things that makes no sense at this world today, except as a kind of celebration of power and the ability to bring into one's sphere of influence a really large group of people, which is kind of what is happening in the Asante area today. So I think there's probably a whole ripple effect of kind of references and evocations within these forms. Thank you.
Suzanne, I was wondering, back to your question about the origin of the ewer as it emerges as an English object in Ghana, what becomes Ghana. And this is just a reflection. In the 16th century, the great royal collections of English silver become incredibly important as collections of the highest of artisanal craft that are gifted as diplomatic gifts to signify new relationships across Europe. And the most important collection of that material that survives, because of course almost all early silver gets melted down and recast, and almost no English silver. As you know, this is such a rare object. It's rare because these objects get melted down in England itself and across Europe, exists in Russia.
Wow.
Because the Russians do not melt down their diplomatic gifts. And so the largest collection of Tudor and Elizabethan silver survives in Moscow. And what made me, I of course thought about this as I was looking at this ewer from the 14th century and thinking, I wonder if this is about trade routes or about diplomacy in some way, because it is royal objects that actually are given by the court to diplomats securing new trade relationships to sweeten those gestures that will then result in very important international alliances. of course, you point out that the notion of the nation state as we think of it today doesn't exist in Africa, but it's really just emerging in terms of modern Europe itself. And I'm wondering if it's possible, there's no way one could perhaps prove this, but it's just another strand of possibility that this 14th century object that comes out of probably a royal, the royal collections of silver that are part of the Mint's collection, which is where these objects are secured for diplomatic purposes, might have been one of those objects that is used in an early gesture toward diplomatic relations.
Bingo.
Possible.
I think that makes an awful lot of sense, and for a couple of reasons. I was looking at where it might have come from. Of course, there's such a strange post-history of Richard II himself, right? And that it complicates everything.
Yep.
And where those who were loyal to him ended up, and where were those collections. I was going down more the path, but I like your idea better, that what's happening in the 1760s in Britain is a real reshaping of society. You had those who had family and ties in the East Indies who came back incredibly wealthy with emeralds and everything else, who are buying up old homes and mansions of people who could no longer afford there, whose families had died off. And so I was sort of imagining going into that area off the kitchen dining room where all of these things are kept, and somebody going and said, what's this strange thing? Let's get rid of it. So that was my attempt at thinking this through, as opposed to those who had family in the West Indies who were involved in the Caribbean, which was really an up and down trade and a lot of economic loss, really, and really a very different situation from the East. And I was thinking about the Norwich area, but I think that this makes so much sense, particularly insofar as in how I read its form and these sword ornaments. I think that they came together. And I think that the fact that it probably came with a new punch bowl with a mark on the bottom of it, I think speaks volumes, because that would have had to have been commissioned, and that would have been an expensive commission. I mean, the other thing that I would add to this that I find interesting as part of this story, the first ever production of Richard II took place off the shore of Congo in a ship. And why? Because the worst possible thing to happen when you're aboard ship is to be becalmed. And how do you deal with a group of incredibly nervous, frightened sailors than to keep them busy? And apparently the print shops were near the port of London, and some of the very first prints of Shakespeare's plays get brought on board. And I think the second or third ever Hamlet is off of Sierra Leone with one of the local chiefs. So, and this was also a point when I spoke of piracy, but it's a point in time when Europe has finally realized the Spanish and the British and the Dutch are getting together, and they're saying, this piracy isn't working for us anymore. We've got to find another way. And so they decide that they're not going to do it, right? And so what they're doing is to begin to think about using European culture as a means to engage with local African communities. So aboard one of these ships, there's a huge organ that's being sent to Turkey. There are all kinds of things that are happening. And so that also, if you think about punch and tea kettles, you're really talking about the exportation of culture. Of what is of value to society. And so I think that that's really a terrific idea, and I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Well, it would be a pleasure to talk more about it, but I think your lecture is pregnant with the possibilities of endless conversations with this small but very interested audience, and those of you who join us from afar. And I know that we will look forward to talking with Suzanne further about ideas that are so important to our own community in so many ways. So please help me in thanking Suzanne for a really splendid.
Thank you. Thanks so much.